Hello, I'm Alex Rushton, and this is my emerging technologies production piece, The Nessie Hunt. The aim of my project was to create an engaging AR treasure hunt using Adobe Aero that utilises the university's campus, thus giving new and prospective students a way to familiarise themselves with some of the most frequented and important buildings on campus. It is designed to be played with a printed map that shows the rough locations and whereabouts of 6 Nessies I have placed on the campus. I got this idea from something that is already in place at the university as part of Welcome Week. During Welcome Week, students will engage with a similar mystery/treasure hunt that takes them across campus and into buildings looking for different clues in order to solve a mystery. Within the experience themselves, the Nessies are hidden from the user's camera view until they enter a proximity trigger that reveals them. This trigger space is recognisable to the user through an audio cue that triggers upon entry and exit of the proximity area. Therefore, if the user does not spot them immediately, they still have the opportunity to re-enter the area and spin around until they find them. As part of my design process within Adobe Aero, I did take into account some AI design considerations to make sure that my project adheres to any applicable standards. I mainly limited these to 3 main key areas: the user experience and visibility. Whilst I didn't include any text within the final project, it was considered as part of my design. I did, however, regularly test and iterate on the size and positioning of the Nessie models themselves to make sure that they are in an easy to reach location and are large enough to be easily spotted by the user. However, as I did a wider test, I found that the positioning and placement can vary on the device of the user due to how Adobe Aero and Google interact with the GPS and tracking location of the project. Next was physical safety. The player will be navigating the experience in the real world whilst using their phone camera to find these AR objects. Therefore, I consistently tested and looked as I placed the models in the real world, just to make sure that they aren't obstructing the view of any hazards or placed in any hard to reach or dangerous areas. Through this experimentation, I found that Adobe Aero includes a disclaimer. When anyone opens a project, it asks that the user make sure they're in a safe area and consistently aware of their surroundings. To help with this, I also made down periods within the project. This is done through spacing the Nessies out across campus with at least a 1 to 2 minute walk between them. Therefore, the user has time to look away from their phone screen to make sure they are safe, and if this does inadvertently trigger the user to exit the experience, there is a QR code on the map for them to rescan and re-enter. Finally, technical considerations. Whilst in Adobe Aero, I took into account that the software is still in development and in beta. Therefore, I made sure that anything I built works within the technical considerations of the platform. This means that with Adobe Aero being in beta, the tracking and positioning of objects in the real world isn't one-to-one every time or consistent across every device. This also affected the original scope of the project, as I planned to include the whole of the university campus, but only part of it is actually being 3D scanned and is available on Google for Adobe Aero to utilise. As part of my design process of the project, I did encounter a few challenges. The first came when texturing the Nessie model itself. I found that the UVs of the model, when I just did them automatically, were distorted and had many hard edges, which were not usable to create a smooth and textured model. I resolved this by reverting to an older version and re-optimizing the UVs using the cut and sew tool to create smoother geometry that therefore resulted in a smoother, more consistent looking model when I textured it in Substance Painter. I also had issues with the file size on the model, due to the file size limit in Adobe Aero. I found that the base export format from Maya, which is FBX, meant that I could only work with 3 Nessie models before the software had issues with loading the models in the real world. Through some research, I found that GLB works much better for 3D models in Adobe Aero, and I was able to resolve this by exporting the models into Substance Stager and exporting the models into the new file format, thus allowing me to add more Nessies to the project. My final hurdle came when adding and testing the proximity triggers in Adobe Aero. To start, I was unable to get the proximity triggers to work fully. This was due to the activation distance being too short for the GPS technology to really pinpoint where the user and object is. To resolve this, I increased the trigger distance. This also varied depending on the position and area of the Nessie, which seems to have resolved the issue as a whole. Within some of the larger areas, the distance is much larger, and within some areas where it's more confined and there is a less area for the Nessie to place is slightly smaller. The main wider areas are near Canham Turner and the Students' Union because they're placed in a wide open area, so the wider area helps the user locate these models. To also help with this, it's also where I added in the audio trigger. This just helps again and reiterates where the Nessie is placed and helps the user find them. Finally, I have a few areas where I can improve the project if I were to take it even further. The main area of my project was to create an interactive treasure hunt for new students to use as a placement of the Nessies would lead them across campus to some of the most utilised buildings. This should in theory make it easier for new students to navigate campus. It'd be nice to see this data, to see how students utilise this experience and how they then navigate campus. For example, I could have Adobe Aero open up a URL link to see how students are interacting with the experience and if it is useful enough for its intended purpose. It would also be possible to swap out the Nessie models for something more suitable if the university were to want it to move forward. For example, I could use the SU's mascot, Percy the Penguin, to make it sure that it is more university friendly and works with their branding. Whilst in Substance Stager, I also experimented with the base assets and materials within the software. This was to get an idea as to how I could also leave some clues and to have the Nessies represent the buildings they are near. For example, I could have one with like a beaker and a lab coat outside of the chemistry block, one with books and glasses near the library, or one inside a box near the accommodation box. Within my plan I also mentioned animating the Nessies. Within Adobe Aero there are behaviour triggers available that can be used to start an animation. If I created some base animations similar to a dancing Nessie GIF that I found, and have them trigger when the user walks into close proximity with the model as part of the proximity trigger. I could also, however, use a tap trigger. This would have the animation play when the user taps on their screen on the Nessie to make it more interactive and add to the overall experience.